Well, it does seem in a way that they both see this as an opportunity because, Donald Trump has couched his conversations with Vladimir Putin not just about bringing an end to the war in Ukraine, but about collaborating, including between Russia and China on, getting, lowering stockpiles of nuclear weapons, talking about cutting defense spending between the three of them. He's floated the idea of whether the three of them should be sitting down at some point. And that sounds like a much broader reset of the relationship from the US side too, at least from Donald Trump's perspective, than ending the war in Ukraine, although that's clearly his number one priority in the minute on it. But we know from some of the readouts of the meetings yesterday and the comments made afterward that they did talk about a lot. They talked about economic ties, which is code for, at some point, is the US going to lift sanctions on Russia, or at the least stop enforcing them so much, perhaps in the short term. So that clearly was on the table for the conversation yesterday. And so about, energy cooperation, energy supply and so on. And it's very clear that this is part of a broader perception from Donald Trump that he wants Vladimir Putin back in the conversation as a whole, and paving the way for that potential meeting one-on-one between them, which could still come as soon as this month.
This is Keith Kellogg, the US Special Envoy, has arrived in Ukraine this morning. We've been looking for the commentary out of Vladimir Zelensky, who of course was not invited to this meeting. Now, Russia and the United States pledging to end the war in Ukraine as soon as possible. But what does all of this mean for President Zelensky and the government in Kyiv?
We could see yesterday when Zelensky announced he was no longer travelling to Saudi Arabia today that they've really been taken very aback by how quickly this is moving, and certainly from the comments from the US, which seem to be raising these concerns that do the US and Russia essentially agree on some parameters here and then present them to Ukraine as a fait accompli. Here, sign this agreement, which would do things like enable the US to have access to Ukraine's critical minerals and so on, but really presented to Ukraine in a way that it's like, we'll take this on our terms or not. And so what is the involvement of Ukraine in framing a peace deal or a ceasefire deal with Russia? How much can they be in the conversation? You can see Ukraine and Europe increasingly concerned about that. But at this point, what is Zelensky going to be able to achieve? The big meeting, was in Saudi Arabia yesterday. It's not with Kellogg in Ukraine today. Even if he takes him to the front lines and shows him the direct impact of the war that's still going on and what it's having on the people of Ukraine, it does seem that these conversations are being led instead by people like Mark Rubio and Waltz, and they're not in Ukraine today.
Yeah, I keep coming back to the question, Ros, of how much can Europe and Ukraine do to stop this? Is it going to happen to them? Are we overestimating America's leverage over this? Is Trump overestimating his own leverage over this?
Well, he seems to be pretty confident, but as you say, Europe either way would have to play a role in this, and certainly in whatever agreements are made around security understandings for Ukraine. It's very clear Donald Trump does not want US troops in Ukraine. So if there has to be a peacekeeping force in Ukraine after this, who's going to make that up?
But even on that, surely Vladimir Putin isn't going to have peacekeeping troops, i.e. NATO troops, in Ukraine. He's not going to settle to a peace that involves that, surely.
Well, the interesting thing is, you can see how this might be heading when we talk about peacekeeping troops. Are we talking about troops that come in from, I don't know, Africa, South Asia, in the kind of international peacekeeping troop vein that we've seen before? Is that acceptable? But really, to be a proper peacekeeping force, you don't need 5,000 troops at the back end. You need potentially 100,000 or more troops that are actively involved in protecting Ukraine. And can you get those numbers from anywhere else, if not in Europe? So there's a lot here that's very unknown, as you say, and there's a role that Europe would have to play. The question is, how much can they get involved in the conversation again versus having something presented to them?
And of course, at the same time, you have leaders in Europe looking at the latest tariff announcements out of the White House as well. Donald Trump now talking about 25% levy on cars, on pharmaceutical exports, on semiconductor imports, I should say, coming into the US. How is that latest announcement being viewed from Europe?
Well, it's been viewed in the vein of the most recent ones also, which is Trump has announced that he intends to do something, but Not yet. And in the intervening period, does that get changed? He's announced a lot of tariffs on different things and in different countries, and by and large, aside from China, has then said, well, we'll hang off and do that in a month from now, and that allows at least a conversation to take place. So for the market, you can see, perhaps they are getting a bit too complacent, but at the same time, they're saying, well, we see these announcements, we want to kind of see what is borne out in reality, be it on the auto sector. I mean, that is particularly significant for Europe if the auto tariffs were to take hold, obviously given the car makers here. But again, markets and investors seem to be saying we want to see what actually comes from all of this.